So I wanted to do a cool little TS parameter video. I just got my DATS3 in, and I got the sub connected, and I wanted to measure the TS parameters, and I wanted to measure them when they were hot, when the driver was hot, when the suspension is warm, spider, surround, etc. Because I noticed when I was breaking them in a couple weeks ago, they felt pretty loose after that, but then once they cooled down they felt stiff again. So I wanted to see if there's any measurable difference and see if it has any major effect. So let me switch over to the DATS3 and we'll do a little sweep on it. Alright, sub's still warm, we got the DATS3 connected. Let's do a little sweep. Alright, let's see what we get. Nice and smooth, no weird anomalies. Look at that, our FS 27.5. When I first did this when it was cold, it was 39 Hertz. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to let it sit overnight, breaking in. Maybe it's not completely broken yet, but we'll see. So it's been about, what, 3 minutes? Let's run it again. So 3 minutes of cooling. It's already up at 30 Hertz. So let me give it some more time cooling. Let's see how high up it gets. Alright, it's been another 5 minutes. Let's do another one. $31.7. So I'm just going to run it overnight, breaking in, and then I'll get a final cold reading and a final hot reading. Alright, it's the next day. It's been throwing all night. So now let me disconnect it and get a warm TS parameter reading. Alright, got the DATS3 connected. Let's run the sweep. $27.3. I'll post pictures of my finalized before and after, cold and hot. So I'm assuming it's fully broken in now. So now I'm going to let it cool down completely and then take the TS parameters again. Alright, it's been about 5-6 hours. It's equalized temperature, so let's see what we get for TS parameters. $34 Hertz. Alright, I'm going to get the full parameters and we're going to compare that, all the theoretical values in WinISD. So we're in WinISD. I got the driver parameters uploaded for each of the tests. So right here, this is the online specs for the Banhammer. And then over here I have the measured cold after fully broken in, and then measured warm after fully broken in. So let's compare the parameters between online specs and cold fully broken in. So right off the bat, the FS is pretty close. 35.45 is what online states, and 34.29 is what I measured cold. QTS is just about spot on, you know, everything's a little close. QMS is a little different. QES is spot on also. Pretty close. The only discrepancy I saw with the MMS is the weight difference is kind of substantial, which might be an indication of the weight when I placed it on to measure the VAS, but it's kind of iffy. Maybe, you know, trust it with a grain of salt, I guess you could say. What else did I notice? The VAS, 9.08 on the cold, or on online, and 12.48 on measured cold. So now on all these, ignore this. I don't know what I'm doing wrong, but I just kind of let these populate after I fill this out, and it always changes it to like one voice coil in parallel when it's really two in series. But anyway, that's the two comparisons there. Now here's where it gets real interesting. So we're just going to compare my measurements to my measurements because they might be inconsistent based on this MMS calculated value. But this is where the comparison gets a little interesting. So right off the bat, let's see here. On the FS on the cold versus the FS on the warm. These are both fully broken in. The FS is 26.9, so 27 hertz when the spider's warm, the surround is warm, and 34 there. QTS pretty similar, QMS pretty similar, QES, you know. The VAS, the suspension compliance, does show that it is soft or more compliant. The MMS value, oddly enough, this time it was closer to the online weight readings. So that's telling me there might be something weird when I added the weight and it just wasn't consistent, or I couldn't get it to stick to the cone properly, or a whole bunch of factors that could have had that issue. But the FS, if you're curious on that, that's what's constant between these two. Now, what else did the BL? A little bit higher with it. Again, it might be the variation on added weight calculation. But those are the specs there. Now let's boot them up and see what the transfer wave magnitude graphs look like. So here we are in WinISD. We're going to compare the EMF online specs to the EMF warm that I measured, and we're in the same box, 3.8 and tuned to 32.5. This is what my box is. The subs are mounted, or they're going to be mounted inverted with an external 6-inch port, and that's the length I get out of the port, or what I have measured, accounting for the flare. That's my box basically. So let's compare the online specs to the EMF warm that I measured. So as you can see, pretty much the same thing, just slightly bit lower and a slightly bit louder. Other than that, very similar. Alright, now we're on cone excursion, and these are all set in the same box, 3.8, 32.5 tuning, and input power. This is for 2 drivers. I have it set to 5,000. So now here is the online specs. 26 is the reference. I figured that's probably where it's at. I don't know the top plate thickness and the coil length. That would be the proper way to determine what the Xmax is. So let's look at the cold EMF, what I measured after fully broken in. So you can see here, pretty similar around tuning, pretty much identical. You can see it's a little bit more compliant when you go above and below tuning. And I'm guessing maybe mine is more broken in than what the online specs were taken at. Now let's compare EMF warm. So right here, very similar. It's kind of like right in the middle around tuning and above. But you can see below tuning is when the excursion kind of gets out of hand. And that would indicate the softer compliance with, or not softer, more compliant suspension with them being warm, spider, and surround. So that's that comparison. Alright, this is where things get a little interesting. So this is the impedance graph in the 3.8, 2 drivers, and tuned to 32.5. So here is the EMF online. You can see the tuning is right at 32, and it's the lowest impedance, about 4.1 ohms. So this is where things get a little interesting. And then let's just take a look. So EMF cold, fully broken in. That's a pretty substantial change. It's a little bit, I would say, slightly bit more peaky bandwidth-wise. Well, not bandwidth-wise, but it's more peaky at the tuning frequency. We got like 7.9 ohms. And now let's look at the warm. Okay, this is where it gets really interesting, because it went even higher, 9.2 ohms, and of these 3, you can base an efficiency. Well, this is all theoretical. You'd have to put it in the box and really measure and find out. But theoretically, the warm EMF Banhammer broken in is the most efficient in this enclosure. on that simple basis of impedance rise. But that's where things were very different. So now I'm going to compare the Banhammer to another sub, specifically the Contralto 12 from Crescendo. Let's look at the parameters that I pulled offline for those. So you can see it's got a low FS, and a lot of people look at that and they think, all right, it's built for low end. But you can't really take these specs online, literal, because you don't actually know. You have to have it in hand and measure it and see what it actually is. I wanted to compare DefBonce and Avatar subs to this, but their values were not adding up correctly. Like on a 12, the MMS for, I think it was the Apocalypse, the 35 or 3000 watt version of that 12, it was showing like a 96 gram cone, or not cone, but moving assembly, which is way underweight, which is wrong. So I had to throw those out, and I couldn't compare them. So anyway, there's this. QTS is pretty low. Indicate, really low or really small box. VAS is kind of a little bit higher, so it's got a more compliant suspension. The MMS is a lot lighter than the Banhammers. So again, you can't really take this for what it is online, because you actually don't really know. Anyway, let's compare that with those given specs. Let's compare it to the EMF warm, because I feel like that's a more accurate parameters to use, because when you're playing it, your sub is most likely going to be warm. So they're in the same box. You can see the Contraltos, you would think with the lower FS they'd perform better, and that doesn't appear to be happening, and this is all theoretical again. But let's go to the box and let's change the tuning to 25. Now let's change it to 25 on this one. Again, it's showing up as, the Contralto really struggling to keep up, I guess. Well, not keep up, but it's designed for something else. It's not in its optimal box, and for this example, this is what we're pulling up. So you kind of want, if you want flat sound, you want it to kind of be within this area and even. This one's a little peaky, this one's a little bit more flat. So let's try and get the EMF Banhammer to a, let's see how low it'll go. Let's shoot 22 and a half. I'd probably go lower, 21. 20. 19. All right. So look how much lower, according to this theoretical, look how much lower it goes than a Contralto 12. Very much lower. I mean, it doesn't hit I think they call this the F3 is when it starts rolling off the most. We're at 17 hertz, whereas right here we're at 24 hertz. Same box, different tuning, trying to go for the flattest curve in a ported box. So there's that. So we're back on the same box, same tuning, and we're looking at cone excursion between the EMF and the Contralto. So as you can see, the Contralto isn't as controlled with cone excursion at this tuning box size theoretical. You can see you turn up the power, your excursion is going to get more, and you're going to have basically, if you're really pushing it, it's going to bottom out around this range, and it's going to bottom out around this range. But this is all theoretical, so that's what that looks like. Now we're looking at the impedance graph. So this is kind of the indication of how efficient the subs are in the same box. So here's the Contralto. We drop down to 6.4 ohms, and then the EMF, we're sitting at 9.2. So I would say that's somewhat substantial. It's more efficient in this enclosure, but you are going to need a bigger amp, because your what's it called, your amplifier is going to be fighting that counter EMF while the coil is moving in and out of the motor. It's kind of hard to say which has the more powerful motor, because it's based on excursion, and this doesn't graph excursion based on power. Well, it graphs excursion based on power, but it doesn't really indicate any change on the impedance graph, and maybe it doesn't. But if it doesn't, then that means that the EMF has a stronger motor setup. So the combination of the top plate and the coil, the gap, etc., is indicating in this scenario that the motor is stronger than the contralto, which may be conflicting because the contralto has a big magnet. It looks big. Anyway, that's that. Now we're comparing the EMF Banhammer to what I currently have, which is the RE Audio XXX12s. Same box, same tuning. This is what we got. So you can see this is not a real good indication. Well, not indication, but it can't hit as low, even though it has a ridiculous FS. And this is online specs. I don't want to pull my sub out and do a free air because it's a pain. But this is what the online specs indicate. 21 hertz FS, and I don't know, that's probably cold, but I don't think this sub is susceptible to parameter changes when it's warm because it uses a real thin rubber surround. It's not thick foam that like really heats up when in use. Same with the spiders. The spiders are super soft and they don't feel rubbery like the Banhammers do. The Banhammers feel like they have like a rubber coating to them, whereas these RE Audios, they feel like cloth. They're very dry feeling. You can see the VAS. It's a very compliant suspension. Very light cone and coil. It has an aluminum coil. The Banhammer has a copper coil, so that's why we see a big difference in the MMS. BL is very low because it has a very thick top plate, so that kind of adds up. Xmax, I just put them all the same so I can have a reference, but the online specified Xmax is like 58 millimeters, which I mean could be plausible because of how thick the top plate is and the coil is very long, but it kind of defeats the purpose of all they're going for is excursion, not sound quality. Sound quality is more distortion because the way the cone moves. If you were to graph the cone position, it should match up like a perfect sine wave, but in reality it's not in this motor structure and coil setup and whatever. But anyway, those are the parameters right there. Now let's look at the cone excursion. So I would say this is very accurate for the RE Audio because it's very peaky, I guess, but if I play it tuning in this box, it hits thermal way before mechanical. But if I play anything above or anything below, those things are like jackhammers. They bottom out bad, and I have to modify my music and crossovers to really control the excursion because it gets out of hand quick. And that's probably due to the very loose or very compliant suspension. Going over to the impedance graph, again, the Banhammer does appear to be a more efficient combination for this box, theoretically. So there's that. Now let's compare the Banhammer to the Brick House Black Brick Audio. It's got a 4-inch coil, and it uses the same basket, and it's got a giant motor on it. So let's look at the specs that online posts. And already there's a discrepancy with online because there's a picture of the parameters and then they're listed on the website and they don't match. So I went with the picture because it showed an impedance impedance chart, so I figured, oh, that's got to be more accurate. But look at the high FS, high QTS, or not high, but it's higher. Suspension is very similar, same stiffness. Cones the mass is quite a bit lighter, but yeah, there's the specs there. So now let's compare that in the same box and see what we get. Same tuning. Again, not very. It can't hit as low, as loud. Let's look at cone excursion. Why not? Not as controlled. Again, you can't really say any of these things because I would have to have the speaker with me and measure it and compare it like that. Now let's look at the impedance. Again, not as efficient in the box. So there's that comparison. Now let's compare the Black Brick BB3. This is like the cheaper version. Let's look at the parameters. These are again online. 28 FS, so pretty good. QTS, pretty low. Pretty compliant suspension. Well, compared to the Banhammer that I measured. Again, just cone mass, etc. Same box, same tuning. There's that. Let's look at cone excursion. There's that. Impedance. Again, indicating the Banhammer is more efficient. So there's that. Now I'm going to do one more comparison just to compare. Now we're going to compare a DC Level 5 Elite 12, which is a very expensive sub, but I liked it because of the parameters. So, you know, you shouldn't really base it off parameters because you don't know what they actually are, because they could use it for advertising. I don't think DC is like a bad company and that they would do that, but you got to be suspicious of everyone because they're all making money. Anyway, let's look at the parameters. Alright, QTS pretty low. I used to always look at subs with low QTSs and low FSs. So pretty low, hits all the points. There's the mass. You know, there's all the specs. Now let's compare it to the Banhammer Warm. Alright, it's indicating that it can't play as low as loud, or the box doesn't complement the sub as well as the Banhammer. Now let's look at cone excursion. Alright, these are pretty similar on control or on cone excursion. Now let's look at impedance. Impedance, not quite ideal for this enclosure on the DC. So those are all the subs I have to compare. Now let's just do like a wrap up, I guess. Alright, so let's do all the comparisons together. So we'll start off with the Contralto. Alright, so my goal, what I want is I want a real low hitting sub. I like to hit really low because I'm weird. But there's the Contralto. Let's look at the Brick House, the BB3, DC Level 5. So all of them kind of don't perform as good for what I'm looking for in the Banhammer in this enclosure and in this tuning. So now let's look at the impedance, so which would be the theoretically most efficient in this box. So we got Contralto, Brick House, BB3, and DC Level 5. So as you can see, the Banhammer is still the most efficient at the tuning frequency. So it's more suited for this box theoretically, given the parameters are all correct, which I don't think they are. But anyway, that's that. So what else was I going to say? Oh, and then if we look at the EMF online specs, it shows it as being the least efficient. So that's what you kind of have to take away from this, is how accurate are the TS parameters, how accurate are they, you know, when put into these modeling software, especially if you're going to put in a car, because the car is going to affect it, and this I don't think accounts for loading based on port diameter and whatnot. But that's what I found very interesting, is the online spec shows this as a very inefficient sub in this box. But as for the transfer function magnitude compared to the warm and online, very similar. I mean, not much different. It still acts the same way, you know what I mean? It's just slightly, once it's broken in, like they always say, hits a little bit lower and a little bit louder. But as for modeling the box, it's very similar. So there's the comparison I wanted to make. With all that information, kind of take the TS parameters for not what they are, but just be suspicious. And low FS and low QTS doesn't always mean this thing's going to be hitting low. But there's a lot of gray area and whatnot. But there's my observation. Maybe we didn't get to anything. And we didn't learn anything from this, but I thought it was cool. So thank you for watching, and I hope to be testing out these Banhammers in the near future. And we'll see how good they do.